December 19, 1944. Outside Stavelot, Belgium, the fog clung to the snow like a shroud. Lieutenant Frank Gibeon of the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion crouched in the frozen ditch, his breath a cloud of jagged ice. His M10 tank destroyer was perfectly positioned, hull down, overlooking the road. He had waited 6 hours for this. The sound came first, a heavy rhythmic clatter and a deep, guttural engine growl that vibrating in his teeth. Then, emerging from the mist like a prehistoric beast, a German Königstiger, a Tiger the Sow, crawled into his sights. It was massive, its 150mm frontal armor sloped back, seemingly indifferent to the war. "Range, 700 yards," the gunner whispered. "On the turret flank, fire." The M10's 76mm M1 gun bucked, a sharp crack in the muffled air. The M79 armor-piercing round was true. It struck the Tiger's turret side, a perfect 90-degree impact. A bright flash, and then nothing. A long, ugly black scar appeared on the dark camouflage paint, but the round had shattered, failing to penetrate. The Tiger II, unharmed, stopped. Its colossal 88mm KWK-43 gun, a barrel over 23 feet long, began its slow, methodical traverse toward the M10's muzzle flash. "Again!" Gibeon screamed. But there was no time. The return shot was an explosion of sound and pressure. The M10, with its open-topped turret and thin armor, simply disintegrated. From a ridge 500 yards away, Major Elias Thorne, an ordnance liaison officer, watched through his binoculars. He lowered them slowly. The image of the M10's ruptured hull burned into his vision. He had seen this 3 times since dawn. The new 76-meter gun, the weapon that was supposed to give American crews a fighting chance, was failing catastrophically against this new generation of German armor. The prevailing belief, the doctrine that American speed and numbers could overwhelm German quality, was dying in the frozen mud of the Ardennes. The field reports he was sent to verify were not exaggerations. They were understatements. The problem wasn't the crews, and it wasn't the gun. It was the ammunition. What Thorne saw that morning was an impasse in physics. But he also remembered a classified file, a rumor from Aberdeen Proving Ground about a projectile made not of steel, but of something far harder, a silver bullet. Its codename was T4. It was a turning point, not just in the battle but in the very science of armor and penetration. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden stories of the war, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Major Thorne huddled in the back of a canvas-topped truck, bouncing violently on the frozen ruts leading back to the command post near Spa. The after-action report from the 825th was brief and brutal. 3 M10s lost, 0 enemy armor confirmed destroyed. The crews had reported at least 22 impacts on 2 Tiger II tanks, with 0 penetrations. Thorne was not a frontline commander. He was a metallurgist by trade, a man who understood the granular structure of steel. He saw the battlefield not as a map of tactics, but as a laboratory of extreme forces. He closed his eyes and reimagined the impact. The M79's hardened steel cap striking the Tiger's face, hardened nickel steel plate. The American projectile, traveling at 600 feet per second, was attempting to punch through 150 millimeters of sloped armor. But the German plate wasn't just thick. It was engineered to defeat this exact kind of attack. It was designed to shatter the incoming round on impact, sacrificing a small spall of its own exterior to destroy the projectile before its kinetic energy could do the work. The American solution had been macroscopic, a bigger gun, a heavier shell. The Germans had responded with a microscopic solution, superior metallurgy. Thorne arrived at the field HQ, a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse, and found chaos. Radios crackled with desperate calls for artillery support. Staff officers, hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, barely registered his entry. He sought out the battalion's S2, an intelligence officer. "I need the ballistic charts for the 76mm M1, Thorne said, his voice flat. The officer tossed him a binder. "Don't bother, Major. It bounces. Everything bounces." Thorne ignored him, flipping through the pages. The data was clear. Against the Tiger I's 100-meter frontal plate, the 76mm M79 AP round was effective only inside 500 yards. Against the Panther's 80mm sloped glasses, it was almost useless, and against the Tiger II, the charts had no data. It was too new. The weapon they had shipped to Europe by the tens of thousands was already obsolete. This was the mystery he had been sent to solve. The official reports back to SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, were sanitized. They spoke of stiff resistance and well-defended enemy armor. They did not use the word invulnerable. Thorne sat in a corner, shielding his notebook from view. He began to write a memo, not to his immediate superiors, but to a contact at the Ordnance Department's Aberdeen Proving Ground. He wrote of the shatter gap phenomenon, the failure of capped rounds against the new German plate. Then he wrote 2 words: Project T4. He remembered the briefing from early 1944. It wasn't a shell, it was a shot, technically. No explosive filler. It was a sub-caliber projectile. A heavy, dense core of tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances on Earth, sheathed in a lightweight aluminum body. This pot, or sabot, would peel away after firing, leaving the narrow, incredibly dense tungsten dart to fly at hypervelocity. The T4 round, later designated HVAP, hypervelocity armor piercing, achieved a muzzle velocity not of 2,600 feet per second, but of nearly 3,400. It didn't punch armor. It drilled it. It was a rumor, a ballistician's fantasy. It was also, Thorne realized, the only possible answer. What he didn't know was that his unsanctioned memo, sent over a scrambled teletype line, would set in motion a desperate search for a weapon that, according to official inventory, did not yet exist in the European theater. The crisis in the Ardennes was a failure of intelligence, but it was also a crisis of physics. By late 1944, the Allies had achieved near-total supremacy in the air and in numbers. But on the ground, they faced a qualitative impasse. The Wehrmacht was fielding armor that was functionally immune to the standard-issue anti-tank weapons of the U.S. Army. The M4 Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, a superb infantry support weapon, was useless. Its M48 high-explosive round was its primary ammunition, but its armor-piercing M61 shot could barely scratch a Tiger I. The response was the 76mm M1 gun, mounted on upgraded Shermans and tank destroyers. Its standard M62 APCBC, armor-piercing capped ballistic cap round, was a marginal improvement, but it failed to reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal glasses. The M79 AP shot was just a solid piece of steel, and as Major Thorne witnessed, it was shattering. The problem was one of overmatching. The German 80mm KWK-43 on the Tiger II fired a 22-pound shell at 300 feet per second. It could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor from over 200 yards away. The Sherman, in return, had to be within 100 yards to maybe get a lucky penetration on the Tiger's rear armor. This technical disparity was detailed in cold, bleak reports from the field. A U.S. Army Operations Research Group study, conducted after encounters in Normandy, concluded that it took, on average, 5 M4 Shermans to defeat a single Panther. Of the 5, 3 would likely be destroyed. Against the Tiger II, the numbers were simply theoretical. The Bureau of Yards and Docks, normally concerned with naval construction, was even consulted on creating massive static anti-tank defenses, as mobile warfare had become so costly. The problem was not just the gun, but the doctrine. American tank destroyer doctrine called for M10s and M18 Hellcats to be hunters, flanking and ambushing enemy tanks. But the Ardennes forests, with their few roads and channeled avenues of approach, made flanking impossible. Engagements were head-on, and in a head-on engagement, American technology was failing. The 90mm M3 gun, mounted on the M36 tank destroyer, was effective, but M36s were scarce. The M26 Pershing, with its own 90mm gun, was still months away from combat deployment. The U.S. Army was trapped in a lethal equation. They had to fight the world's most advanced armor, and the tools they had been given were inadequate. The data streaming into Eisenhower's headquarters was chilling. Entire armored columns were being halted by one or two enemy heavy tanks. The 106th Infantry Division had been vaporized in the opening days of the offensive. The 7th Armored Division was in a desperate fight for St. Vith. This was not just a tactical problem. It was a crisis of morale. The statistics, penetration in millimeters, velocity in feet per second, were abstract. The reality was visceral. It was the smell of burning oil and rubber. It was the sight of a tank crew hopelessly trapped as their vehicle brewed up. The tankers called their M4 Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter's slogan, "Lights up the first time, every time." This grim gallows humor masked a profound terror. Crews began welding scrap metal and sandbags to their tanks, desperate for any extra protection, even though they knew it was futile against an 88. The winter itself was a weapon. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Engines refused to start. Lubricants froze solid. Men who exposed their hands for more than a minute to service a weapon suffered agonizing frostbite. The fog was relentless, grounding the P-47 Thunderbolts that were their guardian angels. The tankers were alone. This was the human consequence of the technical failure. For every dry report citing projectile shatter, there was a crew like Lieutenant Gibeon's, erased in a flash of white-hot steel. The psychological weight on the surviving crews was immense. They were being asked to advance, to hold the line against an enemy they knew they could not kill. They were effectively ordered to die, hoping their sacrifice would buy time for the artillery or the infantry. They felt betrayed, not by their commanders, but by their equipment. In letters home, they spoke of the 88s with a kind of superstitious awe. They were ghosts, firing from distances the Americans couldn't even see, striking with an accuracy and power that seemed supernatural. The logisticians and ordnance officers back in Paris or London saw the problem as a supply chain issue. But for the men in the frozen foxholes and the frigid tank turrets of the Ardennes, it was a fundamental breakdown of physics and faith. Experts at the War Office and the Ordnance Department had reviewed the situation. Their consensus was bleak. Without the 90mm gun in overwhelming numbers, the German heavy armor could not be reliably defeated. It was, they concluded, a technical impossibility. Major Elias Thorne was not a soldier by nature. He was a man of calipers and microscopes. Born in 1908, he grew up in the shadow of the steel mills of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had earned his degree in metallurgical engineering from Carnegie Tech, fascinated not by the size of structures, but by the crystalline grain of the metals that held them together. He spent the 1930s at Allegheny Ludlum, working on new stainless steel alloys, and, more importantly, on the incredibly difficult process of sintering tungsten carbide. He was an expert in hard metals, i.e., materials that could cut steel itself. When the war began, he was 33. He was not drafted. He was a critical industrial asset. But in 1942, he volunteered for the Army Ordnance Department, believing his specialized knowledge could be of more use. He was commissioned and sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, he was outside the traditional chains of command. He worked with civilian engineers and ballistic scientists on the bleeding edge of weapons technology. Thorne was quiet, almost academic, a stark contrast to the hardened combat officers he now served. He wore his spectacles with a strap, and his pockets were often filled with micrometers and small metal samples. His mind was forensic. He saw the failure of the M79 round not as a tragedy, but as a data point. He understood why it shattered. He had seen the early test firings of the T-4 projectile. It was a concept borrowed from the Germans themselves, their Panzergranate 40, and the British. But the American version was designed for the high-velocity 76mm gun. It used a core of tungsten carbide, designated stellite in some reports, that was 7 times denser than lead. This density, combined with its high velocity, created an immense concentration of kinetic energy, over 30 megajoules, in a tiny area. It was physics as a weapon. This background shaped his thinking. He was not intimidated by the invincible German armor. He knew it was just steel, and he knew that everything, given the right application of force, could be broken. Thorne's teletype to Aberdeen was a massive breach of protocol. He had bypassed 3 levels of command to query a black project. The response he received 24 hours later was not a reprimand, but a single cryptic line from his former colleague. Project T4 no longer test. Designate M93. Check inventory, Liège, Manifest 77B. This was the spark. The rounds existed. They were in theater. They were simply lost. Thorne confronted his superior, a logistical colonel named Habsburg, who was trying to manage the entire supply flow for the northern shoulder of the bulge. "Sir, I have reason to believe a shipment of T4 experimental rounds is at the Liège depot." Habsburg didn't even look up from his map. "Major, I am currently missing 40 Auseren rounds of 105mm HE, 2 mobile bakeries, and an entire company of winter boots. I don't have time to look for your experimental ammunition. It's not on any priority list." Denied. Thorne persisted. "Colonel, this round can kill tigers." Habsburg finally looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Nothing kills tigers head-on. Get out of my office, Major. You're chasing silver bullets." Thorne knew he was beaten through official channels. The M93 rounds, if they existed, were buried under tons of rations, blankets, and standard ammunition. The system was too rigid to find them. He would have to go himself. He requisitioned a jeep and a 2 5-ton truck, filing the paperwork under Field Ordnance Quality Control Inspection. It was a lie, but a plausible one. He found a cynical master sergeant from the Quartermaster Corps who owed him a favor for losing a report about a damaged artillery piece. "I need to get into the Liège depot, Sergeant, and I need to inspect a shipment that isn't on the books." The sergeant spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "Liège is a mess, Major. The Luftwaffe has been bombing it for 3 nights straight. You go in there, you're on your own." Thorne nodded. "Just get me through the gate." He was acting on a hunch, a single line of teletype. If he was wrong, he would be court-martialed for deserting his post and misappropriating vehicles during a major enemy offensive. But if he was right, he might just find the answer to the 88. The depot at Liège was a vision of logistical hell. It was square miles of wooden crates, stacked 20 feet high in the mud and snow, lit by arcing searchlights that swept the sky for German bombers. Red-faced MPs shouted at truck drivers. Fires burned in the distance. Thorne and the sergeant parked their truck and began the search, armed only with the manifest number 77B. They spent hours in the freezing cold, checking crate markings with flashlights. "It's hopeless, Major," the sergeant said, his teeth chattering. "This stuff is stacked by date, not by content. This manifest could be anywhere." But Thorne wasn't looking at the main stacks. He was looking at the problem area, a section of the depot reserved for damaged, mislabeled, or non-standard cargo. There, under a ripped camouflage tarp, he found a small pallet of long, thin wooden crates. The stencil was faint, but unmistakable. 76mm shot, T4. Manifest 77B. There were only 30 crates, perhaps 150 rounds in total. Thorne felt a surge of adrenaline. He ordered the sergeant to load 5 crates onto the deuce and a half. As they were securing the load, a shell, friendly anti-aircraft artillery or a German bomb, it was impossible to tell, exploded 200 yards away, showering them with frozen mud. "Time to go, Major!" the sergeant yelled. They drove out of the depot, the truck's engine straining. Thorne now had the rounds, but he had no authority to use them. He was in possession of classified, non-standard munitions. He couldn't just hand them out. He needed proof. He drove back toward the front, not to his own HQ, but toward the sector near Malmedy, where the fighting was heaviest. He found a battered company from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion pulled back to refuel. They were the survivors of an encounter that had cost them 4 M18 Hellcats. Their commander, a young captain, was skeptical. "Major, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but we've got our orders. We don't engage the big ones. We report them." Thorne replied, "I have something new. I need to test it. Do you have a range?" The captain laughed. "The range is that way," he said, pointing east. "And it shoots back." "No," Thorne insisted. "I need a control. A target." The captain pointed to a field 300 yards away. In it sat the hulk of a Panther tank, knocked out days earlier by a P-47's bomb. It was a perfect test bed. "Get your best gunner," Thorne ordered. An M18 crew, curious, rolled their Hellcat into position. "Load standard AP," Thorne said. The gunner fired the M79 round. It struck the Panther's 80mm sloped glacis plate and ricocheted off with a high-pitched zing, leaving a white streak. "Told you, sir," the gunner said, spitting. "Now," Thorne said, handing one of the new rounds up to the loader. The M93 looked bizarre. It was a dull black, and the projectile seemed almost too small for the casing. "Load this. Same spot." The loader shoved the round home. "On the way!" The M18 76mm gun fired. The sound was completely different. Not the familiar boom, but a sharp, flat crack, like a giant whip. The tracer was intensely bright and flew visibly faster. It struck the Panther's glacis. There was no ricochet. There was no explosion. For a second, nothing. Then a small, bright orange glow appeared where the round hit. The metal itself, flash-melted by the friction. The crew stared, silent. Thorne, the captain, and the gunner walked cautiously to the dead tank. The air smelled of ozone and hot metal. On the glacis plate was a perfectly circular hole, no bigger than a silver dollar. It was so clean, it looked like it had been drilled in a machine shop. The captain shined his flashlight inside the dark hull. The tungsten penetrator had punched through the front plate, obliterated the transmission, traveled through the engine block, and exited out the rear armor 15 feet away. The gunner just whispered, "Jesus." The captain turned to Thorne, his eyes wide. "Major," he said, his voice cracking, "how many of these do you have? If stories like this of battlefield innovation fascinate you, stay with us. The next chapter of wartime technology might just surprise you." News of the magic round spread by word of mouth faster than any official report. But it also reached Colonel Habsburg, the logistical officer, who was furious. Major Thorne was summoned to a field command tent near 3rd Army HQ, where General Patton's get-it-done attitude was clashing with the rigid supply structure. The tent was heated by a single pot-bellied stove, and the air was thick with cigar smoke. Habsburg was there, along with a bird colonel from G4, Logistics, and to Thorne's surprise, a one-star general from Patton's staff. "Major Thorne," Habsburg began, his voice tight with controlled rage, "you are here to explain why you abandoned your post, requisitioned vehicles under false pretenses, and distributed classified, experimental munitions to a frontline unit without authorization. You have, in short, royally screwed my entire inventory system." The G4 colonel added, We have priority levels for a reason, Major. Those rounds, if they are even viable, have not passed final theater approval. The tungsten carbide makes them prohibitively expensive. We can make 20 M79 rounds for the cost of one of yours. Me. Thorne stood at attention. He was an engineer, not a debater. He knew he couldn't win on procedure. He opened his briefcase and took out two objects, placing them on the simple wooden table. The first was a large, misshapen fragment of a standard M79 AP round, shattered on impact. The second was a single, sleek, 5-pound tungsten carbide penetrator, recovered from a destroyed Panzer IV. "Gentlemen," Thorne said, his voice quiet, "this," he pointed to the fragment, "is what we are currently supplying to our tank destroyers. It is a failure. It shatters on contact with German face-hardened plate. This," he picked up the M93 penetrator, "is what I misappropriated. It does not shatter." The general from Patton's staff leaned forward, intrigued. Habsburg interrupted. "This is irrelevant. The cost analysis—" The general cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Cost. Colonel, are you aware of what a single Tiger tank costs us? It costs us a dozen Shermans. It costs us a battalion of infantry. It costs us the road to Bastogne." He turned to Thorne. "You say this round works. The after-action reports from the 705th are enthusiastic. They claim 2 Panther kills, head-on. Is this true?" "Yes, General," Thorne said. "It defeats the Glacis plate at 800 yards. It defeats the turret front of a Tiger I at 10 yards. We have not yet tested it against a Tiger II, but the physics are sound." The general stood up. He looked at Habsburg. "Colonel, find every single one of these rounds. I don't care if you have to fly them in from Washington. Get them to the 4th Armored Division. Major Thorne, you will personally supervise their distribution. You're dismissed." The true test came not on a practice range, but in the brutal, grinding counteroffensive of January 1945. The weather had finally broken, and American armor was pushing the Germans back from the bulge. Lebrun. Near the town of Neuville, a forward element of the 4th Armored Division, equipped with 77 Siebener Shermans, ran headlong into a rearguard element of Schwer Panzerabteilung 506, a unit equipped with the dreaded Königsteiger. It was the scenario every tanker feared. Open ground, and the enemy had seen them first. The first 88 mm round screamed past the lead tank. The American crews immediately deployed smoke and tried to reverse. They were outgunned and outranged. But this time, they had Thorne's rounds. Each 76 mm tank had been issued just 5 M93 HVAP rounds, locked in a special ammo box. The order was clear. Do not fire unless you have a confirmed Tiger, and do not miss. A Sherman platoon commander, Lieutenant Dave Ritchie, found a hull-down position behind a stone farmhouse. A Tiger II was 900 yards away, its massive chassis presenting a clear target, utterly confident in its invulnerability. "Gunner," Ritchie said, his heart pounding. "Load HVAP, aim dead center mass." The gunner, who had seen his rounds bounce for weeks, was skeptical. "It's a King, Lieutenant. We're just going to make him mad." "Load it." The M93 was chambered. The gunner aligned his sights. "On the way!" The Sherman rocked from the hypervelocity shot. All eyes watched the tracer, a thin white line that seemed to cross the distance in an instant. It struck the Tiger II's 150 mm frontal plate. A brilliant white flash. The German tank stopped. For a moment it sat immobile. Then a panel blew off the top of the turret, and thick, black smoke began to pour out. A second later, 2 crewmen bailed out of the hatches, their uniforms on fire. The American crews on the radio were silent, in total disbelief. They had just killed a King Tiger. From the front. The psychological impact was greater than the physical one. The spell of German invincibility was broken. A second M93 round from another Sherman struck a second Tiger, penetrating the massive gun mantlet and jamming the turret. The German attack faltered. The crews, who had operated with impunity for weeks, now realized they were vulnerable. They began a fighting withdrawal. The M93 was not a war-winning weapon. There were never enough of them. But in the critical engagements of the Ardennes counterattack, it provided a lethal, tactical edge that saved hundreds of American lives. By February 1945, General Patton's Third Army was requesting that all 76mm ammunition shipped to them be the M93. The silver bullet was no longer a myth. The immediate consequence of the M93's success was a frantic scramble for tungsten. The rare metal, also known as wolfram, was a strategic bottleneck. Most of the world's supply was controlled by Portugal and Spain, and Allied command entered a fierce bidding war with the Axis, who needed it for their own Panzergranate 40 rounds, to secure it. Production of the M93 ramped up, but it never came close to meeting demand. For the rest of the war, it was a rationed and highly prized asset. Tank crews hoarded it. An M18 Hellcat crew might only carry 2 or 3, saving them for the boss tanks. Its performance was legendary. Ballistic tests confirmed what Thorne had predicted. It could penetrate over 140 of rolled homogeneous armor at 1,000 meters, a performance that rivaled the much larger 90mm gun. It effectively upgunned every 76mm Sherman and M18 on the battlefield, giving them a punch they were never designed to have. It was a stopgap measure, but a brilliant one. Long-term, the M93 and its German counterparts signaled the end of an era. The age of conventional full-caliber steel AP shot was over. The future of anti-tank warfare lay in sub-caliber penetrators, focusing on extreme velocity and material density rather than sheer weight. The M93 HVAP round was the direct technological ancestor of the APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds used in the 1950s, which in turn led to the APFSDS, armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot, rounds used by modern tanks like the M1 Abrams. These modern long-rod penetrators, made of tungsten or depleted uranium, are the direct descendants of the small dart that Thorne's crews tested in the Ardennes. As for Major Elias Thorne, our composite hero, his story is typical of the war's technical innovators. He received a Bronze Star for his meritorious service and his initiative in the field testing of experimental ordnance. He was not celebrated in headlines. After VE Day, he was honorably discharged, returned to Pennsylvania, and went back to his work in metallurgy, his role in breaking the Tiger's armor buried in classified ordnance reports. Today, the battlefields of the Ardennes are quiet and forested. Memorials to the 101st Airborne at Bastogne or the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Stavelot mark the places of sacrifice. The physics of war, however, has not changed. The eternal duel between armor and projectile continues. The M93 HVAP round was more than just a new shell. It was a shift in philosophy. It proved that brute force, thicker armor, a bigger gun, could be defeated by applied science, by a deeper understanding of materials. The tungsten core penetrator that flew from a 76mm gun in 1944 is the same principle that guides the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon on the A-10 Warthog, a gun designed to shred modern tank armor from the air. The armor on an M1 Abrams is no longer just steel, but a composite matrix of ceramics and depleted uranium. The shell, in turn, is no longer a simple bullet, but a fin-stabilized dart traveling at nearly a mile per second. The M93 was an act of battlefield desperation, a silver bullet that arrived just in time. It did not win the war. The war was won by the colossal weight of Allied production, the crushing power of its artillery, and the total dominance of its air forces. But for the men in the tanks, the men who had to face the Tigers head-on, it was a lifeline. It was tangible proof that their engineers had not forgotten them. It was a weapon born of impossibility, a defiance of the expert opinion that it couldn't be done. The hulks of the tanks that once littered these woods are gone, salvaged for the steel that Elias Thorne understood so well. But the idea they represented endures, that no defense is perfect, and that the human mind, under pressure, is the most potent weapon of all. Every great idea begins as an act of defiance against impossibility. What impossible ideas do you think could change the world?